Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Nutanix Weekly. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I've got Jaira Cox with me. Jaira's a consistent co-host over here and the man with all the knowledge. So in a situation like this where we have to shift our format a little bit and choose a different topic, I know I've got somebody to lean on. And today we're going to talk about the exciting world of Nutanix Files. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because it truly is a value-add part of the Nutanix solution that if you're smart, you take advantage of and get a lot out of. Hey, Jaira, no stress, but I do want you to know that this is my last thing I'm doing before I go skiing out west for 4 days. So we better make it.
Record short podcast incoming.
Well, and Harvey Green, XenTegra sales engineer, has joined us as well. Harvey, how's it going?
Pretty good.
You may be muted.
Oh, am I?
No, you're good. You're good. I got a delay on my side. All right. Well, Harvey, you should see in the chat window, and I will post it again. But I guess Harvey we will give you a chance to speak. I know you're a couple minutes late, but you're working hard on a scoping call. It sounds like.
Yes. Yeah, I was. It's Monday.
Love a good scoping call for sure.
Which means it's not Sunday anymore.
That is true.
Hey, Harvey, you're a pretty dependable guy, right?
I try to be.
Had a guy tell me one time, the only problem with being a dependable guy is everybody depends on you.
That is correct.
Jaira and I were just talking through the discrepancies of being a sales engineer or consultant versus maybe on the business development side, and talking about living around palm trees and going to work every day. Long story. We'll have to fill you in sometime. All right. So Jaira,
to do with your upcoming ski trip?
It's got a lot to do with my wife's trip to Charleston, South Carolina last week, which is the bar's been set pretty high.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So Jaira suggested that since our original topic has gotten shifted out a couple of days, that we cover the latest release with the Nutanix Files. So we picked a release document from Nutanix to go through. And Jaira, you said there were a couple high-level topics or really important notes in this release that you wanted to cover with us. So let's do that. Where do we start?
Yeah, so the biggest one I find like super exciting about this release is the DR upgrades, right? So we've had files for really quite a while, actually. I think that just my mental math going back, it's at least 5-ish years that we've been running virtualized file servers on Nutanix in a clustered scale-out fashion.
Well, help me understand that, because the way you just said it kind of confused me. Virtualized file server. So it's files as a service, basically, right? The user doesn't know their file servers. It's a
Correct.
service.
Right. So it's if you're an admin, you're in Prism, you basically hit the I want a file server button and tell it you want like 1 VM, you want like 3 VMs, something with resiliency at the app level, and that would survive like a hardware failure. And then whatever you pick, right? Grow it later on, grow from 3 to 4 to 5 if you need more concurrency, need more capacity. So we've had that for a while.
Now that's really NFS, right? It's kind of like NFS, or is it iSCSI or both?
Well, it's NFS or SMB, depending on what you want, right? So usually SMB for like a Windows VDI or app server-based computing environment, NFS for Linux file shares as well.
And what's so nice about that, say from a Citrix perspective, which obviously we talk a lot about, you're getting the benefits of data locality in many regards, and you're not leaving the cluster for sure. You might not even leave the box.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, locality, yes. To apply a grain of salt to that, it's still a network-based protocol, right? So you're going to go out of NIC and go somewhere else to get that data retrieval. But I would put it more as, hey, it's going to be a high-performing application on Nutanix, right? So all of our data management and, if it's a hybrid cluster with HDD, tiering the hot data onto flash also can apply to that file's workload. But then all the other goodness, right, of it runs on us. Therefore, if you throw one of those HDDs, if a disk fails, or you want to grow the cluster, it as a citizen of that cluster gets all the benefits of running on that platform, right? So the same reason you virtualize anything on Nutanix then applies to file servers as well. Plus, to be candid, we make it, right? So you get to call our support if you have any questions, right? Best in the industry support. And you get to upgrade it with our tools, right? So we call it Lifecycle Manager, where you go and it does a full inventory of what's in the cluster, shows you here's the new firmware, here's the new hypervisor, here's the new AOS, and it knows how to apply all that in the right order. And Files is just part of that chain, right? So that integration is something you couldn't get with like a hand-built like window clustered file server.
I'm getting way ahead of ourselves. I know this, but if I decided I want to go to Acropolis, clusters, right, and the
Yep.
clouds, I guess my data is going to just go with me.
Either way, right? So yeah, it runs files as a app, right? A file server is just an application on us, runs on AHV, runs on vSphere, can run up in clusters in AWS, all 100%.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Harvey, any firsthand experience getting to use the Nutanix file system?
Absolutely. And I'm a big fan of it. And for those of you who are listening and are not sure of some of the other things that we always talk through about Nutanix, this is something else, to Jaira's point, that you will be able to do directly out of the same Prism pane of glass. You don't have to, have something else set up. You don't have to go somewhere else to manage it. You don't have to go anywhere else to configure it. Everything's still being done out of the one place, the single pane of glass. It is a lifesaver.
Yeah.
So we've had that for quite a while, and our strategy for doing data protection, right? So how do I recover from, like, if my entire site goes dark, right? Big power event kind of outage, has always been replication based. The same way we've had replication from cluster to cluster forever and a day. We can pack up the entire files application, ship it to another cluster, and then recover it over there. Even if you need to, like, update the Active Directory pairing or re-IP stuff, that's all natively. There's a walkthrough for all of that. What's cool is we're even shortening the recovery time there. So it used to be we would ship a copy of those VMs that was powered off to the DR site. Now we're going to run those VMs full time. And there even is a read-only copy of your data sitting out there. So now it's just a matter of bring that share and mark it as writable now. Update DNS to say, I own that share now over at that file server cluster. Clients can get repointed, and it drastically shortens your recovery time to fail over or fail back, right? Because if whenever those VMs are running, right, they're going to stay in sync. They're going to keep replicating the data at your defined intervals.
And what's the shortest definition I could have there?
So today, for this release, it's 10 minutes from prod to DR. Watch this space for that. So that should continue to decrease. We've gone from, over the life of files, we've gone from stuff like nightly to hourly to now 10 minutes, and we'll keep on going down. Are
there requirements as far as bandwidth and latency that impact that?
No, there's really not. Even on our regular core VM platform, when we shipped near sync, which goes from 1 hour to 1 minute deltas, when you do the math, it's all about change rate. So a big change that you take an hour to send is actually the same sort of average data rate as a snapshot every minute that you take a minute to send. So it's not more or less data. So it doesn't really change the game on your required bandwidth.
So Harvey, I'm sitting here listening to this and thinking about how great a solution this would be for a provisioning server, and my brain just starts going into Swiss cheese thinking about that. Jaira, are you familiar with Citrix provisioning server?
Yeah, for sure.
So, obviously the Citrix PVS solution really doesn't fit in the Nutanix world if you're using machine creation service and the beauty of Nutanix and local files and local file access. However, we've always longed for this really robust, resilient SMB-based solution in Citrix provisioning server world. I think you just solved it, but I should never use it because I don't need it.
I've heard smarter folks than me tell me that we make MCS easier to implement than any other platform, and full steam ahead on MCS. But for sure, we absolutely support PVS as well.
We've still got quite a few diehard PVS fans out there. They're more of the guys that are like
they're an opinionated breed. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a situation now where we're talking to a customer about Nutanix, and they're telling me they want to run Gen 1 and use PVS with Nutanix, and I know why they're doing it. It's a way to get there quicker without having to rebuild their image. Right. But I'm really challenging them not to do that because it'd be like buying a new car and putting your old seats in it or something. All right. Well, Jaira, I think we've talked a little bit about this. I don't know where we stand with the document. What things did you want to highlight from this release?
So some other pretty exciting stuff actually is I love how we're getting into, and we'll keep on advancing with ransomware protection. So, ransomware, as you guys know, I'm not telling you anything new. the biggest attack surface area is always in the end user space, right? Because it's always users clicking links, users opening attachments.
Correct.
So most of those infections start in the end user space, and then those things always want to attack attached file servers or mapped file servers. So with this release, we're starting with trying to help customers get more ransomware protection. We already have lots of recovery options from snapshots and replication and all that jazz. But how do we even try to nip it closer and closer to the bud itself? And the first one's going to be we've got known bad file extensions. So when you run ransomware, it renames all of your Word documents from .docx to .xyz, something else. We know, hey, that .xyz extension is a bad extension. Block that file right, which then commonly makes ransomware not, it fails the encryption, which then doesn't delete the source document. Otherwise, they're causing a data loss event, and it's bad for their business model. So
right.
By blocking the write, we block the encryption, which then blocks the attack. And then we can of course catch that, alert on that in Prism, and we want to get into more and more, be able to chain that with other actions you can take to even further remediate that. But today we can block the write. So like I said, it's a very first offering on how we bring anti-ransomware protection to the file servers. We can already, of course, do stuff like snapshot recovery. So you can bring up the entire file server from yesterday or from hours ago, depending on what snapshots you're retaining on the cluster. And then end users can even bring their own files back. So they can even, without even bugging IT, they can say, hey, what's the previous versions of this Word document that I was working on? And browse the file share, do previous versions, do a self-service recovery. So those are both options, as well as, of course, replicate before you even dive into replicating back from another DR cluster. So we want to have a full spectrum of protection there for preventing ransomware attacks.
Yeah, I'll use my southern slang to say that concept of recognizing the file extension. That's stupid simple.
it kind of is, right? It kind of is. I mean, that's some 1990s antivirus level thinking, right? So.
Well, think about it. I mean, a lot of these guys, that's what they use. They use common basic concepts, and that's how they get us. And
oh, yeah. I was talking to a customer a few weeks back, and they were like, ransomware, is that still a thing? I'm like, yes, ransomware is definitely still a thing. Like, you're lucky to be wondering, right? If you have to wonder about it, clearly you've got maybe better users. But yeah, it's like ransomware. That's the genius of it, is that it does what it does in user space with user permissions. So to neuter ransomware, you have to give your users less permissions, which doesn't usually fly.
Yeah. Those are those guys that still don't have their Windows firewall turned on.
Yeah.
Probably a bunch of those. Okay. Harvey, any questions, comments?
No, I mean, I think that one is a very interesting one. It's like, it's almost security by obscurity. It's like, I hesitate to even discuss it further because it's so simple that it invites you to, figure out other things, which I think is pretty interesting. It's one that I would love to see.
It's, I don't know. The vision that came to my mind is like taking your wife's pocketbook and just start by putting it under the seat. It's that simple. Just don't leave it out open.
Right.
You go to these parking lots. I was telling Jairo just in Charleston, the parking lot says, don't leave your stuff sitting out in the open. I was like, well, of course you don't leave your stuff sitting out in the open. Let's at least make it a little hard for them.
It's amazing how that still needs to be said.
All right, Jairo, what other topics do we want to make sure we cover?
So the last one I think we're worth focusing on is so for File Analytics, which is our sidecar included with Files Analytics platform. It watches all your file servers and can tell you data about them. So stuff like data age, stuff like what's on there, right? Who's got the big MP3 collection up on the file server? Who are my top writers? Who are my top readers? All that kind of stuff. We're adding some analytics around data age, which gets really interesting. So we can say, hey, sure, you're storing whatever, 20 terabytes of data on this file server, but did you know that, 90% of it is 3 years old, right? And pretty stale. Do you have a business use case to keep on retaining that? And as we get more and more into that space, we've talked about it at .next as well. It's still coming. The ability to tier off the older data to other targets, right? So that we can keep the hotter data closer to users where it closer to users where it needs to be, send older data somewhere else colder for long-term storage. So that's in Analytics 3.0, which is also part of the release, as well as also fun stuff like even generating your own custom reports. So you can go in there and say, I want to know about my data, right? And show me more than just the canned reports that the previous versions came with. So that's honestly, it's kind of our sleeper feature. Like no one expects it. And it's one of the most compelling reasons about, there's 18 bazillion ways to give SMB shares in a Windows environment. But this is the one that tells you, hey, by the way, what are you bothering to store here, right? Is it worth it? Tell me more data about my data.
Right. Giving you some intelligence so you can make better decisions.
Yep.
Yeah. Who's accessing what and when? I go back to my first sysadmin job in 2000 and me running around asking people, hey, do you still use this share? And who has access to this share? And them having no idea. And man, would have been nice to say, okay, here's what's in it. Here's who's accessing. And I'm sure had they seen it, they'd be like, well, what in the heck? That person's not been in my department for 3 years. What are they doing looking at my annual report or whatever? This data is the most valuable thing in the world, specifically in our industry. And if you get the data in one place, you got a chance of being able to tweak and tune around what's happening for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, it's part of, I love Files as a product, right? Because it's at the core of what we do of making the entire job of running IT simpler, right? Not just one aspect of it.
So Jaira, if I buy a 3-node cluster, how much files am I enabled to have?
Your choice, right? So you can license it. You could run the entire cluster to run files itself if you wanted basically like a HCI powered NAS, or if you wanted to mix it with other workloads, Files is licensed by terabyte or terabit basically. So if you only needed like 2 terabytes of file storage, you just add that to the cluster.
Yeah, I was under the impression there was some kind of crazy number that you get by default normally when you buy a cluster. Every
cluster can kick the tires on it, right? So every cluster by default, turn it on, and you get a terabyte basically included with every cluster. So just fire it up, kick the tires, run it in your lab environment. Try it out. You can deploy one file server for like a dev environment. You can deploy like a 3-node cluster that gains resiliency because you can like have even like an unplanned hardware failure. Files cluster stays up and keeps on running.
So Jaira, is that it? Is that all we want to talk about? I do have a new topic for you. We didn't talk about this one, but I know you're gonna be able to answer it. Anything else about files you want to bring up?
I'm good. Hit me.
Harvey, anything else on your end?
I'm good. I'm curious about what you have now. So whatever I had just went away.
I'll just end it with this. Harvey's got a big sign he's holding up, says, I love Nutanix Files. I don't know what
I didn't pay him to do that. Thanks, Harvey.
Jaira, I did have a comment come up last week about Community Edition and running in labs. What's the latest with, if you're a Nutanix admin and you're wanting to run this thing in a lab somewhere, what's the best way to do that these days?
Yeah. Community Edition, we call it CE, is by far the best way for a permanent lab for sure. With CE, you can deploy a 1-node, 3-node, or 4-node cluster. I think with the latest release, it basically has feature parity and code parity. It's actually a fork of our GA release. So you're running the same code that you'd run in production. It can do just about everything. It can run files like we talked about here today. It can do the Citrix integration for Cloud Connect. It can deploy a Prism Central to get that visibility and manageability. Can do the automation stuff. You can run COM. You can deploy objects for S3 storage. You can deploy Kubernetes in our managed version of that. We call it Carbon. So it can do just about everything the real product can do.
Yeah, I think someday I want to get you on with a podcast, maybe when we don't have an official topic, and just go through some of those features and just walk through some of those. Because I know personally some of those are newer to me and I don't know enough about them. But so Community Edition still lives, and you can still download it anytime you need to.
100%. You find that on our forums, which is, I believe, let's try it in real time, next.nutanix.com. And there's a pinned forum post in there for how do I get Nutanix Community Edition.
And just to talk through a little bit, it's been a year or two since I've done this, but you require at least one SSD drive. Is it still that requirement?
Yeah, one SSD. does not need a fancy HBA the way a real node does. So any SSD should make that work. Let me see if I can pull up the requirements doc for CE as we talk. This is great podcasting material.
And while you're pulling that and while we're talking about requirements, I would want to at least say out loud to everyone, listening, that Community Edition is not for you to see how fast this thing is going to run. These are running on your nodes, your equipment. I mean, you're in control of ultimately of how fast or slow it will be, but at the same time, Community Edition is not for you to try to figure out what kind of performance you're going to get from Nutanix, and compare it to what you would have if you were purchasing a full out cluster. But it is a way for you to get in, start looking at the user experience, start looking at the admin experience and what you would actually have. It's more of the what than the, how fast and things like that.
Completely accurate. Yeah, for sure. And a healthy disclaimer for sure. It is by default, you're installing it on who knows what kind of YOLO lab environment you've got. It is not, the latest Intel Cascade like CPUs like you'd get in a real node from any vendor. And then the one kind of meaningful difference to give it more hardware compatibility, it runs all the storage that the cluster sees in vDisks on top of whatever disks you slap in there, right? So those could be terrible SSDs. That could be 1 drive write per day SSDs. That could be 10 years old. Who knows? And everything, all the storage that a CE cluster addresses is inside of a vDisk, which is then nested on top of some other SSD, which is not the way a real cluster runs. A real cluster runs with direct access through an enterprise HBA against real disks, and every write that it doesn't even traverse a hypervisor. So the plumbing behind under the hood is different than a real cluster, but the software that you can run is accurate, right? And it is a true representation. So you can do awesome validation, but absolutely right. Don't throw it on the dyno and do a perf test. I'll tell you now, I'll save you some time. It doesn't run like the real product does because the real product has an HCL. It's verified and vetted with engineering. Whereas this we're giving to you, hey, go run it as a nested VM if you want to, right? And yeah, storage performance is going to be what you expect for a nested VM, but it also will run. So pick your poison.
Yes.
So,
great point.
Disclaimer, right? This isn't for production. I think maybe you guys may have said that. I did also run into, one time I tried to do it on some really junky hardware. I think there's a minimum number of cores unless you change something in the config file. I think it requires
I think it's probably RAM in the controller VM, right? If you spun it up on a 32 gig platform, I think, if you gave, say, 16 gigs to the CVM, 8 gigs to the hypervisor, there's basically nothing left to run as a workload. So you could thin down the CVM a little bit to maybe, back in the day, it could be like 12-ish, give you a little bit more headroom. In general, I think for a happy experience, you should probably, if you're going to do a single node, do at least 64 gig memory.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this was actually the number of cores. Because I ran into it, nobody knew what I was talking. I was trying to run it on like a knockoff NUC. But yeah, skinny down the RAM, minimum number of cores. After that, you got to have some SSD and away you go, right? What is it, about 16 gigs of SSD or 8 gigs? What is it? Minimum.
For SSD, I can't find the requirements doc in real time. I want to say, a healthy guidance would be like, you probably want at least 100 gigs of SSD, right? Because you're going to throw a couple of VMs on there for your OS drives and so forth. And an SSD, 100 gig SSD, you probably find one on the street.
Yeah, we buy them for our nonprofit for 16 gigs for like $10.
Yeah. So yeah, for sure. Obviously not production, not for production because there's no support. It's a community edition. You get the community forums for support, and also the performance is different than the real product because it's more hard. It has a broader hardware compatibility list, but good for kicking the tires. The other one you can do, of course, is it's on the webpage now. It's on the homepage. Is we call it test drive. So you go to test drive, hit I want to test drive now. It'll basically say, what do you want to test drive? Stuff like app dev automation. Do you want to test drive storage or DR replication? And it will drop you into a live cloud hosted lab environment running the real AOS product. So if you don't want to go to all the pain of setting up a real home lab, but you do want to get real hands-on time in a live environment, that's by far the simpler way, is just do a test drive.
Well, and there's even this crazy partner in North Carolina, XenTegra, that will put it in a Pelican case and ship it to you and show up and do it for you.
I've heard of them. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And that would last a lot longer than the 4 hours that a test drive environment gets before it wants to self-destruct.
Yep.
Yeah, that's one of Harvey and I's favorite thing to do. It's been a while because of the pandemic, but we throw it in a Pelican case, throw it on UPS. We meet it up there 2 or 3 days later, 2 or 3 hours of testing and showing the customer how to use it. And then we leave and come back in 30 days and say, how'd it go?
Yeah. No, I mean, I tell my customers all the time, right, is what doesn't jump off the page when you're looking at a checklist of us versus anybody else is the fact that, with our clusters, right, you're doing it all on day 1 or maybe day 2, right? Like cluster stand up in the morning, maybe Prism Central at lunchtime, you're turning comm on by the afternoon. And on, day 2, your developers are in the app store saying, I want a Windows VM, I want a Linux VM, put it on this network,
I want.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Give the people what they want.
I plan to do a podcast on comm at some point in the coming weeks, Tyler. That would be a good one to cover.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've come to the end here, and it's time for me to get out of here and go pack and go skiing for a couple of days. So we'll do it again next week. I appreciate you guys jumping on and being agile and letting us cover the topic that we wanted to cover.
Yeah, man. Be safe on your ski trip.
Yep. Have fun on your ski trip. Don't hurt yourself like Doran. And to all listeners, we also have another Intro to Nutanix Bootcamp on February 12th. That's coming up in a couple weeks.
That's good. That's there's a ton of value in that, Harvey, for people who have never touched it, and even people who have touched it just want a little more in depth. And feel free to ask questions, and we'll go with whatever topics they want to bring.
Absolutely. If they just want to hear my voice more, there's another opportunity for you.
It's a nice voice, but it's not that nice.
Yeah. Thanks. That's how I feel about it too.
All right, gentlemen. Thank you for the time.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank y'all.